Okay, so hello everyone, and as promised, here is a short video to just verbally talk through the Boston Matrix. It's something that I discussed with a few of you over the formative assessments last week, on the Thursday and Friday of last week, and sort of discussed that we have mentioned the Boston Matrix and there is content that has been embedded into one of the lectures on Aula for you to have a look at. But I hadn't actually verbally spoken through it, just to kind of clarify how the matrix is used and how you might kind of use it for your projects. So that's the purpose of this video. So the Boston Matrix is something that you are being asked to include in Part B of your Fashion Insider Methods and Tools unit. You'll see that it's one of the matrices that you're being asked to include. It's basically a widely used model for range planning. So if you think about it in terms of a business or marketing based model, that's used primarily by brands to manage their portfolio of product, and to perhaps categorize their position of the products into certain areas. The reason being that they might be analysing their overall strategic position as a brand and thinking about which products are doing particularly well or which products need more attention, or less attention perhaps. So it's just a way of kind of categorising products into certain quadrants that we're going to have a look at in a moment. Okay, so this is what the Boston Matrix looks like. This is the template version of a Boston Matrix, and we're going to talk through what each of these symbols represent. The important thing is that when you obviously submit a Boston Matrix within your project, you're not going to have the symbols, so you won't have the pictures of the stars and the question marks, etc. You'll actually be replacing these symbols for products from your company's ranges. So from the product range, these will be pictures of products as opposed to templates of symbols, sort of icons. They're just the template that you would then replace with the actual product image. But you can see that there's 4 quadrants. They're called the stars, the question marks, the cash cows and the dogs. And you can see that they've got a different position in the matrix, dependent on the axes that have been labelled on the side and at the top. So what you're doing is basically ensuring that the right flow of product secures future selling volumes and will drive growth for your brand or for your business. So this is hopefully something that you will recognise. So this is the psychographic profile, which we spoke through in one of the classes a few weeks ago. And I know quite a lot of you have had quite a lot of fun trying to draw your curve on this particular matrix. So this is a psychographic profile that we spoke through in relation to a product's life cycle. And what you're doing with your psychographic profile in your projects is plotting the vertical line where you believe your brand's consumer currently sit on the matrix, and perhaps also where your brand wants your consumer to sit in the future if they've got a particular strategy to move the position of where their current consumer buys into their products. So what's quite interesting is that you can actually link the Boston Matrix that we're going to talk through today with the psychographic profile. So you can see on this particular graph that you've got the curved line and the sort of sections that you see on the psychographic profile relating to the product life cycle, and then you've got the symbols that have been taken off of the Boston Matrix and presented in this sort of linear approach in relation to a life cycle. So what we're going to do is talk through what each of these symbols represent, and then how you would then translate that into the life cycle of your product. Okay, so these are the 4 areas. I'm going to talk through them one at a time, and I've positioned them in the order, as you can see here, in the order that they present themselves on the product life cycle. So starting with the question marks, then moving on to stars, cash cows and dogs. Okay. So the question mark, they're sometimes referred to as problem child as well. So some matrices, for some reason, call them problem children. Some call them question marks. They're basically the same thing. We refer to it as question marks at Ravensbourne, but you might hear them being referred to as something else. But they are basically the same thing. what this represents is the first quadrant, so the first part, the kind of introductory section. So if you think about it in relation to the psychographic profile, these are the kind of initial stages of a product's life cycle. So if you remember, we spoke about early adopters of trends. They're the people that buy into trends before the trend has actually become a kind of popular trend, if you like. So there's an area of kind of uncertainty and risk around the question mark, as suggested by the name of it. They have got the potential to develop into stars, so they've got the potential to grow into stars, but they're generally purchased in smaller quantities, so low quantities at a kind of introductory level, because they have a kind of low share of the market. So because people are not necessarily all buying into this product at the moment, they're kind of relatively small in terms of popularity and size of the market for a particular brand. So the important thing is, though, that they're in a high growth area. So they're up the left hand side of the psychographic profile. So they're at the beginning of a product's life cycle as opposed to towards the end of it. So there is potential for these question marks to be developed into stars if they do particularly well. So as I say, they tend to normally be a new trend that's coming out with a level of uncertainty for the consumer. But they can grow and develop if money is invested and there's a strong marketing presence that kind of supports the growth of the product. So if it's kind of seen as something that could do really, really well, then your brand might invest quite a lot of money financially and also kind of marketing campaigns to support the growth of this product to hopefully potentially become a star for them. So the stars, as suggested by the name, is kind of where you want to be. So the stars have got high market share and they're in a rapidly growing market. So if we flick back to this one, we can see that they're kind of at the increase level. They're in the growth section. They're where brands might increase their quantities. They're pretty secure. So out of the 4 of the quadrants on a Boston matrix, your star is your most secure product. It tends to be your strongest product in a growing market. Therefore, marketing spend or investment around that product is potentially a little bit higher because you've come out of the question mark stage, you're more established by this stage, so there's more trust around them. So as a brand, you might endorse these as kind of strong products within your portfolio mix. So they have potential for high revenue growth within the markets that experience a high growth area. They normally have an increasing share of the market, and they can actually become a cash cow if money is invested into them, which obviously links round to popularity. They may not, so they may stay as a cash cow, and as I said, that's a great place for a product to be for a business. But they may actually, as the product life cycle develops, they may actually turn into more of a sort of staple piece, which would be a cash cow. So your cash cow, if we flick back quickly to this is in the maturity stage of a product life cycle. And this is the products that a brand tends to invest money into in terms of maximising their quantities. So they're kind of the mature products, they're stable pieces. They may be kind of staple basic products for a brand potentially. So they might be staple pieces such as sort of staple base layers of black leggings or white t-shirts or whatever they may be. They're popular products that are always in demand. They don't necessarily need much marketing invested into them because they're already popular. People are going to buy them regardless of what the trends are in the initial section of the product life cycle. They're kind of the basic products that people are always going to want to buy. They have the kind of high market share in a competitive area. If you think about cash cows, business, the easiest way to kind of remember it is cash cows. In businesses tend to invest cash into them because they're stable. They know that they're not risky products by any means. So they might invest money into them. And they sort of peak towards the tip as the market and trend begins to slow. So they are at that kind. The important thing is they're in that kind of maturity section. So although they're doing really, really well, there is a point that potentially they could tip over. They may stay in that kind of mature section for a long time, so therefore the brand's not necessarily going to have to worry about them, but they are becoming towards the end of the product life cycle in terms of fashionability and trend driven pieces. Which leads us on to the dogs. So this is the last one if we flick back. So this is the end of the product life cycle as the product is beginning to decline. As a brand, you're going to decrease quantities at this stage. You're not going to suddenly start buying into lots of products if you've categorised them into your quadrant of the Boston Matrix as a dog. So they're at the end of the product life cycle. They have a low growth market with a declining market share. They're the ones that the trend is coming to an end. The product's at the end of its life cycle. There's a low market share in a low growth area, so there's no potential for that to necessarily have a reinvention of itself. As a brand, you tend not to invest into these products. They perhaps are also maybe products that were mistakes, so maybe products that you thought the buyers thought were going to be really successful, but actually the product life cycle was really quick and people didn't buy into them. They were mistakes and they ended up not being successful for the brand and perhaps being sold off maybe cheaply for the business just to kind of get rid of product that wasn't successful. They tend to be products that are phased out and sold off as opposed to invested into. So they're kind of, they're not what you're aspiring to be as a brand. They're potentially inevitable for most brands at some point of a product's life cycle, but they're ones that you want to try and get rid of as quickly as possible. So that is the Boston Matrix and how that would work in relation to a product's life cycle. And also just quickly to touch on the fashion triangle, which again is something that I've spoken to sort of informally with a few of you, but we haven't necessarily gone through it as such. You don't need to worry about necessarily including this within your assignment, but this is just a kind of template that you might want to think about in relation again to how you categorise products. So in terms of building the assortment from your bottom of your triangle, where you've got your essential pieces, your basic products, your cash cows in this example, building up towards the middle where you would have your kind of main bulk product, your main product that's kind of stable, and then at the peak of the product life cycle, the fashion triangle, you would have your highlights. So they would potentially be your question marks with maybe some of your stars in there as well. So the products that are doing particularly well for the business, but they've got a sort of, they're at the peak, so they're not kind of holding the business together. They're a little bit more unstable, not as stable as your cash cows, for example, but they're still an important part of the assortment for your product. So obviously it's all about finding the right balance between the essentials, the middle and the highlights. So if you think about it as a triangle, you can't have just the top part without the base of the bottom. So it needs to all be working simultaneously with each other, and everything needs to kind of be pulling its weight, if you like, in terms of the triangle, the fashion triangle. Okay, so that is the end of that little walkthrough of the Boston Matrix. Hopefully that's clarified some of the questions that any of you may have had about it. Do have a go at putting some of your product into the Boston Matrix for your brand, and it's something that we can look at together in class over the coming weeks. Okay, but hopefully that was helpful for you all.